Hello everyone, and welcome to this next short demonstration video in response to the group who were looking for kind of like a very basic explanation of what rigging is in Maya. And so what I want to do is give you something very basic. So this is my ultra basics of rigging. So we're not going to go into too much detail, but we're going to cover a few things that can sound a little bit complicated if you're not used to hearing them. And that's perfectly fine for now, so don't worry if this is a bit overwhelming. One thing I want to remind people is that rigging is not an essential part of this module. It's actually not even in the curriculum for this module, because it's something that you're going to cover in much more detail in other modules, and to a better standard and quality than I can provide, and by people with much more ability in 3D animation than me. I have many things, but an animator I am not, as you can tell with my incredible cylinder demonstration animation that I mocked up here for you. But remember, above all else, this is pre-visualization, and that our objective is estimations of things that we want, not actual, hard produced things. So what we want is obviously just a few extra tools that maybe help us get out of a bit of a pickle. If you understand rigging just enough, then maybe can help you solve some of the problems that you might run into in your module or your project, I should say, more than anything. So let's take a look at what's really going on here to begin with more than anything. So in the ultra basics of rigging, I'm just going to go in here and hide a few things, of course, to begin with. Control H for hide, of course. You can always press Shift H if you want to unhide things. And remember, the demonstration file is available to download as well once this video is live. I'm just going to zoom in here. And for those who are wondering, the reason why Maya looks this way is no other, it's no secret. It's actually just the normal Maya interface. I've just made this rather spiffing background to hide things in. And of course, that's actually just a rather simple mesh. And of course just a single spotlight. So what's really going on here? So well, I suppose I should explain a rig. A rig, or sometimes referred to as just a rig, or sometimes just as the underground skeleton, is something that we use in animation to control 3D meshes in much more precise ways. You'll see this a lot in computer games, of course, and of course they're used in films as well. There are all sorts of different types of rig out there, and of course the major differences are, the major two categories I would say are of course organic structures such as anatomical structures, animals and humans, and of course mechanical, so things like machinery and technology tends to use a very different approach to rigging, because it's obviously more artificial. And of course, rigging is essentially based on what we would call skeletons, because underneath are skin and flesh. You'll notice that's the words they use. They use words like skinning and skeletons and bones sometimes, depending on the package you're using. In Maya, they call it joints, to kind of create that the underneath what's underneath the skin, and of course to kind of hinge all of our animation off. The idea being is that if you set up a rig correctly, it makes animating complex meshes much easier. Of course, things get a little bit trickier as you go along, and of course that's stuff that you'll be doing in other modules. I just want to show you the basics. So here we can see in this really sort of silly kind of like animation of what is essentially a basic cylinder mesh. If I select that, where is it? You can see here that's nothing complicated. We've all made cylinders before, and it's just hopping across the stage. But of course, if I was to animate that manually by changing all the vertices myself, it would take forever. But the hard work is being done, and I'm going to switch on, you can get shading down to X-ray joints, and I'm going to switch my joints on so that you can see what's actually going on underneath here. So you can see as I kind of pause this in different places, underneath of it there is this little skeleton. I'll zoom right up so you can actually see that in much more detail. That is controlling everything. Now that is inside my outliner as well, which I'll open up. Oh, whoops, there it is. And I've got it tucked under this control, and there we go. We can tease it out. We've got 4 joints, and you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's really what's doing all the hard work. So if I select that first joint, you'll notice that the first joint selects all of the structure. Joint 2 selects the second joint and above, third and above, and of course fourth is just that last one. And you can see as well the direction of travel in terms of hierarchy. Got sort of big triangle down to like the tip of the triangle, and of course that's how everything is controlled. And that's a really interesting way of looking at it. Joints are essentially this little skeleton structure I've designed and mapped the skin of this mesh essentially to that. And of course there's a few automated processes in there that do all the hard work for us. So let's take a look at this I think more closely. Now hopefully I can hide all of this information for you. Hide the cylinder person. And if I move back, I'm just going to unhide a single bone that I've made here. So Shift H to unhide, and that is a single joint, right? I've just went to animate, and then of course gone to skeleton, and then went create joint. So it's nothing fancy about it. A joint just looks like this, and of course, if I was to make a second joint off here, it would be starting to build that chain of joints, much like we just seen. And a joint really is quite boring if we look at it. It's just this kind of pointy thing that tells things where to go. But the idea being is that if all the vertices obey what it's being, what the instructions coming from that joint, of course there's a lot of mathematics in the background, then we can basically move the joint instead of all the vertices, therefore creating a nice estimation of the animation, creating a nice easy way for us to control complex things, which is super useful. And to demonstrate that just very, very briefly, I'm going to do something very simple here, right? So I'm just going to undo all that moving I've just done, and to create a simple polygon structure. And let's just create something simple. Well, we would stick with cylinders before. So this cylinder I'm going to keep reasonably simple, nothing much going on here. I'm going to switch on, make sure XY joints are on, they are. Okay, so for instance, if I wanted to move this cylinder, I've got a bunch of controls already, but say if I was actually mapping it to this this actual joint here, this is an interesting way to look at things. So I'll select, of course you can see, I always select the bottom joint. If I want the original joint, I go to the very bottom, because that's where all the business is. Then I'll shift select this, and of course what I'll do now, switch to animation mode, head over to rigging mode, head over to constrain, skin, and of course bind skin. And then nothing fancy has happened, but we'll see the result of it. So if I use this single joint now, by moving the joint, it's now taking that cylinder with it. So it's doing all this extra work for me, which is wonderful news. So let's undo that skin, and let's add, let's try something a bit different. So let's say if I was to just delete that, and I was to duplicate this and make a second cylinder, and make it a bit shorter just so we can see the difference. And I'm going to create a second joint here. So rigging, skeleton, create joints. It's going to go in at the bottom here, and then obviously at the top here, and then of course I'm going to go off to the side. So we're just a single, nothing much going on here. Very, very basic stuff. And maybe make any adjustments that you want along the way. So there we go. Now let's bind this. So again, I'm selecting the one at the bottom. I don't want to select just the one in the middle. I want to make sure the whole thing's binding. So I'm selecting this, selecting the rest of these cylinders, and of course going to skin, and of course bind skin. And if things have gone well, we can see now that we have a usable skeleton. So you can see how that influences itself. Probably happier if I disable lighting for a moment. There we go. Maybe make things a bit more visible. So you can see here, if I select this bottom joint, this is obviously the parent. So if I control that, whatever happens down here controls this. And then of course if I select this joint, I can move that. Now of course you can see it's bringing information from the the mesh below it as well. But that's okay. There's things we can do to stop that later on. But it's just an interesting way to show you how a very basic joint system would work. Oh, you don't want to do that. You obviously want to control everything from this joint onwards, and of course, do your secondary animations in that one, the little wave. So that's the very basics of joints. So let's kind of put this into practice a little bit one more time. Alright, so we'll go over this a couple of times just to kind of make sure everybody understands. So delete that, delete that, delete that, and our process is as follows, okay? So I'm just going to kind of reset my scene by selecting that, tapping F for focus. Of course, it gives me my stage back. I like a nice clean stage to model on, by the way. I think it makes everything look a little bit more attractive. Not that that's important to me, I just, when sore eyes, you need something better to have a nosy at. So let's create a simple sphere rig, okay? Nothing complicated, a single bone sphere rig. So I'm going to create a sphere by going to create, polygon primitives and sphere, or just by clicking the sphere icon in the modeling tray. And what I want to do before I do anything is just change any variables that I want to play around with to make it a slightly bit bigger. Make sure it's sitting in the middle. One thing I like to do is just play around with the how busy do I want the sphere to be. Wonder if we can go really low polygon. 6 by 6, that might even be too low. 8 by 8 might be something a bit more reasonable. And there we go. Just a really simple polygon sphere. And of course, we can see that that's faceted because we can see all those individual polygons. So I'm going to soften those out with I'm going to select it and go to back to modeling, and I'm going to go to mesh display, and I'm going to soften edges. There we go, soften edge option. And of course that just basically spreads the shading out across that surface. So something low polygon can look reasonably smooth, even though we can see, from the edges that, of course, that is not a smooth edge, that is not a smooth surface. But it's nice and low poly, and that's all I really need at this point. It's more than enough to get started. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to insert a joint, obviously, to rig this. So I'm going to go back to my front view. I find is usually more than appropriate. F to zoom in on that. So I'm just going to click away just to deselect that. And if you really want, if you're depending on how you're feeling, you can enable wireframe mode, of course, by going up to one of these options up here. You can see there's a little box with wires on it. Of course, that means it just lets you see all the wireframes. I tend to use that in my orthographic views rather than my perspective view. I just find it keeps things a bit more comfortable. So I've got a sphere here, and I want to create a joint. So I'm going to change this back to rigging, my little Maya mode. And of course, what I'm going to do is go to skeleton, and I'm going to create a joint, and I'm going to create that right in the middle. So the bottom of the ball, and of course right up to the top of the ball. That's more than enough, or the sphere in this case. And I'm going to press Q to deselect that tool, and there we go. We have a bone, well, a bone or a joint, depending on the program you're using. You'll notice that terminology doesn't stay too much different from each other. And so what first thing you want to do is maybe even rename that to something like, I have my own naming system, such as, I call it a three kind of digit naming system, just so I know what's going on. So JNT under ball underscore 01. You never know how complicated something might get. So this is a simple one. I'm going to go back to this normal view, my perspective view, sorry, just so I can see everything. And that looks like it's all well centered, so nothing really to worry about there. So again, with the bone selected, as we can see it as it is, the whole thing's highlighted. I'm going to hold my shift key and select the ball as well. And of course what we can do is go to skin, and we can bind skin. Now let's have a nosy. How well is this working? So if I've skinned this correctly, the joint now controls the object we've just skinned. So again, if I move that up and down, again, I'm not selecting the sphere here, I'm selecting the joint, and that's really different. So again, you can see that's controlling things fine. And this is where things get interesting. When we select the top of the joint, we get this nice bouncy part because the whole thing is now bounded to that. So now we've got something we can control things with. Alright, so for instance, if we wanted to start animating, we can animate either this or we can animate this instead of selecting the actual mesh to animate. And that's interesting. And of course, this is where things get a little bit more fun. So I think we just want to test this out a little bit further. So I'm just going to select my joint, move it all the way here. And of course, if you really want, you can always open this, and you'll notice that one joint has a second joint already attached to it because it is, of course, the end of that joint. And if you can't, you want to really name that to JNT underscore ball underscore 02. So one point will always cause, obviously because we have a second part to it. When you create your first joint, it'll have that second joint already there as part of it. But if we wanted to do anything, we can't use that second joint. The second joint will always obey what its parent does. And you'll see that little hierarchy highlighted by the little arrows here, or the little lines inside your outliner. So again, if I wanted to move this, it's taking that with it. You can see that nice stretchiness. And again, even that can be handy for exaggerated animation styles as well. But again, if I select the original one, of course that moves the whole thing, which is interesting. So how do we play around with this? Well, let's try making some animation, I guess. So we know that we want this ball at frame 1 to move all the way across to the end of this at frame, well, we'll change that to 100. I think 100 frames is more than enough. So again, I've got this joint selected, and I'm going to press S to keyframe on frame 1, which I hope works. Maybe it didn't. Oh, whoops, I accidentally just typed S inside of there. My apologies, and deselect that. Reselect my joint. So again, I'm at frame 1, and I want to press S. And of course, you can see there, we've got a result. It's now keyframed. Then I'm going to scroll to frame 100, which is over here. And by frame 100, I would like this ball to have moved there, which is this. And of course, that looks like this. Nothing fancy. Wonderful. Alright. Now what if by frame 25 this was starting to change a little bit? So by frame 25 maybe we can animate joint number 2 here and just keyframe that to here, and then we get this number, and then by here keyframe that just a little bit further, and then of course by the time it gets to the end we would like that to maybe head over there. S to keyframe, and of course there, keyframe it, and then back to frame 100, back there. So again, just adding that little egg wobble at the end. Oh, I'm playing it in reverse. Of course, it's not exactly, a very effective one, but maybe we're trying to create that impression of speed more than anything. Like I said, I'm no animator, but again, we can obviously, just play around with that. So as it begins to move forward, we know that by frame 24 that it has a keyframe, so maybe that can be a little bit more extreme. And maybe if we really wanted, we can just kind of resettle it so that at frame 1 it's not so extreme. So we know that by the time it gets there, it's accelerating a little bit more. And maybe by about that halfway mark, actually that's a bit more extreme than what we've got here. So we can keyframe that. And then we've got something a bit more of an exaggerated egg wobble. I'm calling it an egg wobble for lack of a better phrase. And of course we can just watch that back. I'm going to keep that second joint selected. And of course it maybe doesn't need to lean forward there so much, but I kind of like that little snap. Of course, I think more of a tick-tock wobble would be good, but essentially that's the process using a very simple rig. So again, and if I really wanted, I can go and delete all those keyframes, of course, and just start again in order to be a bit happier. So let's try that out one more time, of course. Okay, so let's delete all of this and try this one more time, except this time we're going to stick with our cylinder, the one that we had at the start. So again, a bit more complicated. Going to go up a level here. We're going to drop those sides down to something reasonably simple like 6. I'm going to scroll this up so it looks like that, quite handsome. And of course subdivision height, we'll keep things reasonably simple at 6 as well. Subdivision caps, I don't need those, I get rid of them. Of course we've got something nice and neat here now. And of course back to our front view in here, and we're going to create a rig. So let's go to skeleton, create joints, and of course I'm trying to get everything in the middle because I want it to be like the bones under our flesh, it's not somewhat centralized. And of course I'm going to click to make my first joint and then shift select to sort of create the next joints. And there we go. So that's quite complicated. We're dealing with many more joints at this point. So again, I just move those into place until I'm relatively happy with them. And you can see that I'm sometimes I do this, sometimes I don't. But in this case, I'm trying to line them up with the actual the geometry. You don't have to do this. Sometimes an estimation is more than enough. In this case, you can just move that there. And I think that top part, I want that to be slightly longer because it's just, it's just the head. And of course that gives us lots to play with. So again, that's just one way of doing it. Yeah, you want to play around, that's totally fine. And of course here we've got our joint stack, and we can see here the hierarchy yet again. Sorry, I think if I shift click that, you'll notice it plays it out. So joint 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Of course, we need to rename these. So this is, of course, JNT underscore. This is silly. That's a good enough name. Silly is in that. Silly underscore 01. And of course, you want to leave that there. JNT underscore silly underscore 02. And that's the boring part. Don't have to rename these as if you're just playing about, but it's good to kind of get into that practice. And because it'll always just rename joints after the existing joints are already there, so that's why you'll always get that, because we've already got something in there that goes up to 4 joints, the next joint it'll make is number 5, so you have to kind of rename sometimes. JNT for joint underscore silly underscore 04, and then of course the final one, sorry there's 2, JNT underscore silly underscore 05. And of course, JNT underscore silly underscore 06. And there is our 6 joints. And of course, always click through them to see and show that you understand what's really going on there. And of course, that's fine. It's actually an interesting thing that's happening here, and I'll not explain it just yet, but everything's working out the way we want it to. So again, I want to select my very first joint on that stack, and of course, shift select the mesh that I want to bind it to, and of course I can go in there and do something like skin, and of course I want to bind the skin. Perfect. So let's go and have a look at that effect. Again, I don't want to select the polygon here, I just want to select the joints. And of course, you can see there, that bottom one controls everything. Control Z to undo. Cylinder number 2, now this is where it gets interesting. So look at that. So we'll try and bend these out of shape a little bit. And you'll notice that it's taking this whole thing with it. I'm just trying to make an extreme example here. I'm not being very careful, but you can see how that is now controlled. And we can see everything because we're using a very faceted cylinder design here, which means that we can see every bend and fold that it makes. You might be doing something much smoother and much better looking. But in this case, this is it's working out just fine. And of course, the next stage is to begin animating it, and that's perfectly fine. So undo all those moves I've just made. And make sure that everything looks reasonably simple. It does. And of course that you can begin to do stuff with this, and that's where it gets interesting. So again, if I wanted to animate this, I tend to put it where I want it to go, and then of course I want this object to move, so I'm going to keyframe it, using the first joint, S on my keyboard. That's the position I would like it to be at frame 1, and then of course by frame 100, which is usually roughly, getting 24 frames a second, 4 seconds later. We'll just move that over now to about here. So this cylinder now takes 4 seconds to move across there. And it looks brilliant. And that's fine. So now we can begin to add secondary animation using the available joints. So let's look for the opportunities. So we know that by the time it gets there, it's perfectly fine. So what if, again, much like we did before, halfway, which is frame 50 in this case, we used a different joint. Well, what if it started to tilt that way, and then we had a look at the other joints, and you go tilt those, and of course you see I'm tapping S every time, just to keyframe each bone, because you want to do that individually. S, and of course this one I just want to actually move it. S. So every single one of these joints now has a keyframe, and that will now naturally morph. In this case it won't, because I haven't keyframed it correctly, because obviously they have starting positions as well. I forgot to say, now this is actually a really good point. This is where I've messed up, so I want to undo a bunch of things here. So this is important. So let's undo all of that. So what did Ryan do wrong? Well, here's the problem. I didn't keyframe the entire rig. So this is important. So our rig, we're back to this point where it's this, the whole rig moves from A to B. Okay, so let's now double check that. Other joints here aren't actually keyframed there yet. So we want to be able to select all of these and keyframe them. So again, I'm selecting all of these, and I want to actually keyframe the whole stack this time. And then I want to move to frame 100, and I want to keyframe that. That means now that everything has a keyframe. Whoops. Excuse me. So everything's still moving to the right place. It just means now that we have to go in and have more fun. So again, frame 50, and we know now if I select this joint, we can see that again it definitely is constrained to other keyframes. So again, if that was S there, it's now going to correctly bend a little bit towards there and then flop back, and that's fine. So now we can go and show the rest of the effect on this stack. So again, stack number 3, and again I'm just doing slight bits of constraining here. S to keyframe, joint number 4, even more, S to keyframe, joint number 5, S to keyframe, joint number 6. Again, I like to actually move this one a little bit, just to kind of show some stretch, and S to keyframe. So now, individually they're doing things. You can see now that that joint's now doing what it's told. And now we want to start kind of maybe making that a little bit more wobbly, maybe. So again, I think this could actually definitely be more extreme. So around about here, I definitely think that probably wants to come down, maybe get keyframed a little bit longer. And of course that looks a little bit better, which means around about here, I would like that maybe to extend another couple of seconds. And so this is what we can do now. We can now think about what happens after this. So let's just check things, make sure they're looking. You need to make those noises. Because it's got that stretch, it's fine. And I think actually maybe one thing we could do here around about frame 50, maybe select that middle joint and move it out a little bit. So again, I just want to make sure that I'm not messing about too much. But we've got to make sure though that anything that we keyframe things that we've changed. So again, keyframing all of those. So that's looking like it's got a bit more speed to it. Nothing too fancy. Might want to rotate that one a bit more. Again, your animation knowledge will be stronger than mine at this point. So this is all in slow motion at the minute. Almost like slow tofu. Then of course when we get to frame 100 and beyond, that's where I want things to kind of obviously wobble. Don't have time to go into that now, but that's essentially, that's beyond the ultra basics of rigging. So ultimately rigging is all about one thing. It's about creating a skeleton for the flesh. In this case it's creating a joint for the mesh, and that's really what it is. And it lets us control things in interesting ways. You just have to remember to keyframe things properly. In this case, here's a simple animation where something is moving from A to B, and I'm using the joints to control how I think that should look at every stage. Things to look out for are making sure that you have all the joints selected when you're keyframing the original joints from A to B, and once things are in position, then you can begin to play around with the rest of the rig. So interesting things you can do as well, so for instance this 50% mark, what if things were slightly more twisted? So I'll keyframe that. Joint number 3, keyframe that. Joint number 4, keyframe that. Joint number 5, keyframe that. And of course, then we're going to get something that morphs towards us. Nothing too fancy, of course. But of course, around about here, what we could do is maybe, you know, even play around with that a little bit more and see if it great fun. Anyway, that's the ultra basics of rigging. Nothing too fancy, and of course you can take this all sorts of steps forward. Again, I'm not a technical animator in any way, shape or form, but at least knowing how those work can really give you an extra set of wonderful tools to play with. And of course you can play around with that all day long and have all sorts of fun and see where it lands you. But of course, remember, like everything to do with animation, it's pacing and timing that really matters. In most cases though, for most of us, it's about making sure that we get an object from A to B, and then while it's getting from A to B, what sort of changes and animations can we make to that. In any case though, I'll switch all of this off. See, we can delete that, and we can delete that, and of course we can bring back Cylinder Man. We can switch our lights back on. And of course, once everything's staged and looking good, a simple joint animation show. Of course, make sure all these things are switched on, and they should be. Joints can make for a lot of fun. In this case, you know, 200 frames is probably a better option. That's what the actual length was. Hey. And of course, once we get a camera in there and filming that, you can change a simple wiggly wobbly animation on a stage to something a bit more interesting. The shadow's doing most of the work there though. Alright, I'll leave it there. Any further questions, of course, feel free to ask on the Discord and see where it leads us to. I'm going to leave it there for now. Catch you next time.